When I open the Boston Strangler file, I do not begin with Albert DeSalvo's name. I begin with two documents that do not fit together as neatly as the public story wants them to. The first is a newspaper clipping from a city under pressure. The type has the heavy confidence of the early 1960s, the kind of headline meant to fall fast from a press room to a breakfast table. It gives Boston one phrase to carry: Boston Strangler. The second is a DNA report from another century. It has no headline rhythm. It has the colder weight of laboratory work, a cold case grant, a Y chromosome comparison, a paternal line, an exhumation, and direct testing from the remains of a man who had been dead for 40 years. The headline gave Boston a single name for its fear. The DNA report gave investigators a powerful answer in one murder. The space between those two documents is where the case still lives. Boston in 1962 was a city of apartment buildings, hallway tiles, old door chains, rooming houses, service visits, and women who often had to decide whether the person at the door had a legitimate reason to be there. The case did not begin on a remote road. It began in rooms that should have been private. The victims were found inside apartments or rooms, and many scenes showed no obvious sign of forced entry. That detail mattered because it pushed the investigation toward access. Someone may have been admitted. Someone may have sounded official, useful, polite, or familiar enough to pass the ordinary test at a door. A broken lock points police toward force. A door that appears to have opened points them toward trust, deception, or social pressure. In this case, the hallway was not just a hallway. The buzzer, the chain lock, the superintendent, the repairman's excuse, and the neighbor who only heard footsteps all became part of the file. The phrase "private rooms" is not enough. The rooms contained the pattern that gave the case its name. The women were often sexually assaulted and strangled. In a number of the scenes, investigators dealt with ligatures made from clothing, stockings, scarves, or similar items, sometimes arranged in ways that looked deliberate rather than incidental. Those details should not be described for shock. They have to be included because they are the investigative reason the word strangler had force. A ligature is not only a cause of death in a file like this. It is a clue about method. It asks whether the offender brought something with him or used what he found in the room. It asks whether the act was planned or improvised. It asks whether the knot, the item chosen, and the scene arrangement belong to a repeated behavior or to details that later reporting made too easy to imitate. The first cluster pressed investigators into a narrow kind of reasoning. They could not assume one killer just because the rooms felt similar, but they also could not ignore a repeated method. A woman living alone, a room without a broken door, a sexual assault, a strangulation, and a ligature made from something at hand. Each detail carried weight. The weight increased when those details appeared again. The early victims were not famous before the murders. They became public because of what was done to them. That created another investigative problem. The public often learns a victim's name at the same moment it learns the worst fact about her death. A careful file has to keep the ordinary life in view without inventing private scenes. Age, address, living situation, occupation when known, the building, the hallway, and the last reliable contact all matter because they help investigators reconstruct opportunity. In several rooms, the object used as a ligature was not an exotic weapon. It was clothing, stocking, scarf, or fabric from the life already inside the apartment. That detail is quietly important. If the offender used what he found, then access and control were more important than bringing a specialized tool. If he arranged the ligature or not in a way that seemed deliberate, the scene began to speak not only about death, but about behavior after control had already been achieved. The first deaths did not arrive as a complete famous case. They arrived as separate police calls, separate rooms, separate families, and separate municipal responsibilities. The early names came first: Anna Slezers, Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Irga, and Jane Sullivan. Later, the file widened around younger victims as well: Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Sammons, Evelyn Corbin, Joanne Graff, and Mary Sullivan. Those names show the scale of the file and the problem of its boundaries. The commonly cited series includes 13 women, ages 19 to 85, killed in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. A wide age range like that complicates any single offender profile. The geography complicates it further. Boston was one center of the fear, but the case was not locked inside Boston's city limits. Lynn, Lawrence, Cambridge, Salem, and other surrounding communities entered the file. On a modern map, those places can look close enough to belong together. In real time, each death had its own responding officers, local pressure, and paper trail. Put enough pins on one map, and the eye begins to see a pattern before the evidence has earned it. Keep the same pins on separate police desks, and the pattern may stay invisible too long. The Boston Strangler case sits between those errors. The sequence also created pressure, because some deaths occurred close enough in time to make coincidence harder to accept. Nina Nichols and Helen Blake, for example, were both found dead on the same day in different communities. For police and reporters, that kind of timing changes the atmosphere. It does not prove one man, but it makes separation harder to defend without careful evidence. When two scenes arrive so close together, investigators have to ask what repeats. How did entry occur? Were there signs of a struggle? Was the ligature similar in function or only in broad description? Did the victim live alone? Who had been in the building? Did anyone see a service worker, a stranger, a tenant's guest, a deliveryman, or someone who seemed ordinary enough to forget? Those questions are slow, and public fear is fast. By the time detectives are still sorting what belongs to one file and what belongs to another, the city has already begun sorting the case emotionally. By the summer of 1962, similarities were becoming hard to dismiss. The victims were women, many living alone. The settings were domestic. The absence of forced entry repeated often enough to trouble investigators. The strangulation method and the use of clothing or stalking ligatures gave the file a recognizable spine. The differences mattered just as much. Some victims were elderly. Later victims were much younger. Some scenes fit the common public pattern more closely than others. Beverly Sammons's case, often discussed as one of the more violent outliers, is one reason researchers have remained cautious about treating all 13 cases as if they were identical. Differences do not automatically prove multiple offenders, but they do stop the investigator from smoothing the file into a legend. The police response also had to become public. Warnings went out. Women were told to keep doors locked, avoid letting strangers in, and report suspicious approaches. The advice sounds simple, but in an apartment city it is not simple at all. A building runs on ordinary access: repairs, deliveries, landlords, neighbors, meter readers, cleaners, visitors. Fear asks everyone to stop trusting the system that lets a city function. Some residents bought extra locks. Some looked for tear gas or other protection. Some changed routines. Those public actions were not side notes. They were evidence of how completely the case had moved from police blotter to private life. A murder series is measured not only in bodies and reports, but in how people start behaving before anything happens to them. Then the newsroom entered the case. Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole of the Record American became central to the way Boston understood what was happening. They were not detectives, and their articles were not warrants. Their work mattered because they helped connect deaths publicly at a time when official recognition was still struggling to catch up with the pattern. A newsroom has its own investigation mechanics. Phones ring, addresses are checked, ages are compared, police statements are read against one another. A city editor asks whether the story belongs on page 1. Reporters notice when isolated events begin to echo. The Record American wurde on side a sit where police caution, public fear, and editorial urgency were colliding. A reporter who sees a pattern too soon can be accused of sensationalism. A reporter who waits too long may leave the public unprepared. McLaughlin and Cole moved through that narrow passage. Their reporting also exposed a gap in attention. Deaths of older women, especially women who lived alone, could be handled as separate tragedies more easily than crimes against a public figure or a child from a prominent family. When the reporters pushed the connections into print, they forced a question Boston could no longer avoid. Were these isolated murders, or was a series taking shape? The period headline, "Two Girl Reporters Analyze Strangler," now reads with its own unpleasant historical texture. The wording is dismissive. The work behind it was not. The reporters helped move the case from scattered official language into a public argument about pattern. The phrase "Boston Strangler" was powerful because it compressed uncertainty. People could say it. Editors could print it. Radio could repeat it. Women could warn one another with it. Once the phrase entered the city's bloodstream, police could not control what it did. The name helped because public recognition can produce leads. A landlord might remember an unusual visitor. A neighbor might report a man in a hallway. A woman who had been approached by someone claiming to be a repairman might decide the encounter mattered. A public name can make scattered memory come forward. The same name created noise. A famous case attracts false confession, rumor, attention-seeking, and fear-shaped tips. A man who had read enough newspapers might repeat details that sounded close to the truth. A caller could frighten a family and still know nothing. Investigators needed the public, but they also needed details that remained private, so a later confession could be tested against something other than headlines. The tip sheets would have grown quickly. Names, suspicious visitors, building complaints, service workers remembered after the fact, men seen near stairwells, men who seemed too interested in tenants. Every report had a cost. Ignoring it could miss the one lead that mattered. Chasing all of it could bury the investigation in motion. For women living alone, the fear became practical. Doors were checked more carefully. Service calls no longer felt ordinary. A stranger in the hallway was measured differently. The city's apartment architecture, buzzers, locks, mailboxes, stairwells, landings, turned into a set of small decisions that suddenly felt dangerous. Police had to work from those small openings. Who had reason to be in the building? Who could move through apartment houses without drawing attention? Who knew how to sound official? Was the offender using a job, a uniform, a clipboard, a maintenance story, or just confidence? The public wanted the offender to look obviously dangerous. Police work often finds a colder possibility. The dangerous person may blend in because he understands ordinary manners well enough to exploit them. As the victim profile shifted, the case became harder to hold in one shape. The early victims were older women. Later, the series included younger women such as Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Beverly Sammans, Joanne Graff, and Mary Sullivan. If one offender was responsible, the pattern had changed. If more than one offender was involved, the public label was making separate crimes appear more unified than they were. The age shift was not the only problem. The locations changed. The time gaps changed. Some scenes included details that seemed to belong to the known pattern. Other details sat awkwardly beside it. Investigators had to decide whether those differences meant evolution, staging, imitation, or separate offenders. A change in victim age may indicate escalation. It may also indicate a different offender. A repeated method may be meaningful. It may also be the kind of detail that press coverage has made too visible. The Boston Strangler label encouraged the city to expect unity, while the evidence still had to prove it scene by scene. Massachusetts officials eventually had to treat the pattern as larger than any single city. Attorney General Edward Brooke became involved in coordinating the response, which shows how much the case had outgrown ordinary local handling. Coordination can sound administrative, but in a case like this, it means deciding who shares which information, which details stay protected, and how police departments compare scenes without letting the newspapers define the pattern for them. The case also attracted desperate measures and questionable ones. The use of alleged psychic Peter Hurkos became part of the history, and the episode is worth remembering because it reveals the level of pressure. When a case frightens a city and refuses to resolve, officials may reach for anything that appears to offer direction. The problem is that a dramatic lead can consume time while producing little proof. A file under pressure can begin to gather not only evidence, but spectacle. Jurisdiction added another layer. Boston, Lynn, Lawrence, Cambridge, and Salem were not one police department. Each community had its own officials, its own pressure, and its own path for information. A detail that looked minor in one file might matter only when placed beside another city's report. There was no DNA database in the background. No digital case management system quietly linking reports. No automated search through old tips. Information moved through phone calls, meetings, paper, memory, and professional judgment. A diligent detective could still be trapped by the era's tools. This does not excuse every missed connection. It explains the terrain. Whoever committed these crimes moved through private space, social trust, city boundaries, and public confusion. The investigation moved through paper. Albert DeSalvo did not enter the larger story first as the man everyone now associates with the Boston Strangler. He was arrested in connection with other sexual crimes and break-ins. The labels attached to those cases, the Measuring Man and the Green Man, sound strange now, but they point toward a real pattern of predatory access. The Measuring Man label came from a kind of intrusion that depended on false authority and embarrassment. Women were approached under a pretext connected to modeling or measurement. The Green Man assaults involved another pattern of entry and sexual violence. These were not murder charges, but they placed DeSalvo in a world of disguise, approach, and control that investigators could not ignore. The most important point is not that these offenses automatically make him the Strangler. They show why his name could become plausible once the confession appeared. A man who knows how to talk his way into a woman's space is a different suspect from a random name pulled from a tip sheet. Capability does not equal guilt, but it explains why investigators listened when DeSalvo began to speak. Those offenses matter because they show a man who used deception and false roles to get near women. They also establish DeSalvo as a serious sexual offender independent of the Strangler confession. Treating his confession cautiously does not make him harmless. The question is narrower and more important. Did his confession accurately solve all of the murders placed under the Boston Strangler name? Bridgewater State Hospital gave the story an uneasy institutional setting. It was not a conventional police headquarters. It was a place where mental health, criminal custody, legal strategy, and rumor could sit too close together. DeSalvo's words moved through that environment before they became the public's answer. George Nassar's presence added another layer. He was another inmate, a man with his own criminal history, and the person connected to the way the confession reached F. Lee Bailey. None of that proves the confession was false. It explains why the confession had to be handled with more care than a simple admission taken cleanly at a police desk. The path of that confession made it more complicated. DeSalvo first confessed not in a clean public courtroom, but through the strange channel of Bridgewater, Nassar, and Bailey. Nassar reportedly told Bailey, and Bailey took an interest in DeSalvo. This route created a problem investigators could never entirely escape. The confession came wrapped in legal strategy, institutional rumor, possible reward talk, and the psychology of a man who may have wanted recognition. A straightforward confession can be checked against evidence. A famous case confession has to be checked against the entire ecosystem around it. What did the inmate know? What did the lawyer know? What did police disclose in interviews? What had newspapers already printed? Which details were held back? And were they truly held back from everyone who might have reached DeSalvo? A confession has special power in an old file. It seems to arrange the evidence into order. It gives investigators a voice to test. It gives the public a name to attach to the fear. In this case, DeSalvo's account impressed some people because he appeared to know details from multiple rooms. A confession like this could not stand on atmosphere alone. It had to be tested against small details, objects in rooms, sequence, access, and facts that had not been fully printed. One example often attributed to F. Lee Bailey concerns a chair in one of the rooms. Bailey later wrote that DeSalvo described a chair as blue when a victim or witness had called it brown, and that a photograph supported DeSalvo's description. If accurate, a detail like that matters because it looks like knowledge of a scene rather than a guess about a famous case. That kind of detail is why some people took the confession seriously. A man who can place small objects inside a room may be closer to the crime than a man repeating a headline. Yet the same example also shows why the confession has to be treated carefully. The value of a private detail depends on whether it was truly private, how it reached the confessor, and whether it holds up across all of the cases, not just one. There were also details that did not sit cleanly. In Mary Sullivan's case, later critics argued that DeSalvo's description of the killing did not match later forensic interpretation. The disputed issue centered on manual strangulation versus ligature strangulation. The point is not to resolve that debate in one sentence. The point is that his confession contained material strong enough to impress and weak enough to keep the case open to challenge. A confession after months of headlines is never simple. Investigators must ask what DeSalvo knew that had not been published, which details matched the rooms which were wrong, and whether information could have moved through police, newspapers, inmates, attorneys, or rumor. The test is not only whether he knew something, the test is how he could have known it. A confession can sound long and detailed while failing in places that matter. A wrong detail in one case may be memory decay. Repeated wrong details may suggest performance. A correct detail may prove knowledge, unless the same detail had already traveled through the public or institutional bloodstream of the case. There was another problem with motive. DeSalvo had reasons a detective could imagine for telling the truth: guilt, compulsion, pride, or the need to be recognized. He also had possible reasons to perform: notoriety, leverage, financial speculation around books or film rights, or the chance to turn a series of unrelated convictions into one grand, infamous identity. None of those motives can be chosen like a final answer without evidence. They simply keep the confession from being easy. This is why the confession belongs in the center of the script, not as a quick bridge to DNA. It was the public answer for decades. It gave many people permission to believe the danger had been named. It also left behind the one question every later review had to confront: was DeSalvo confessing from memory, from knowledge supplied by others, from fantasy, or from some mixture of all three? Some people believed the confession because of its scope and apparent accuracy. Others suspected coaching, contamination, or a desire for notoriety and money. Some pointed toward George Nassar and reward speculation. That theory has never become proof that Nassar was the killer. It remains one of the reasons the confession cannot be treated as a clean, courtroom-tested ending. F. Lee Bailey's role made the confession part of legal strategy as well as investigation. DeSalvo was not tried for the Strangler murders. His confession surfaced around proceedings involving other crimes. Bailey tried to use the confession in a strategy aimed at showing DeSalvo's mental state. That is a very different thing from a murder trial testing all 13 deaths. The distinction matters because public memory often collapses confession into conviction. DeSalvo confessed. DeSalvo was convicted. Those two facts are true, but not in the way the shorthand suggests. He was convicted in 1967 on other sexual assault and robbery charges. He was not convicted of the Boston Strangler murders. A trial tests evidence under rules that public belief does not have to obey. Witnesses can be challenged. Timelines can be pressed. Confession details can be compared under oath. Physical evidence can be weighed against alternative explanations. Because that murder trial never happened, the public carried a name that the courtroom had not fully tested. The prison years added their own uncertainty. DeSalvo's 1967 sentence removed him from the streets, but it did not put the Strangler murders through trial. His later escape from Bridgewater with 2 other inmates briefly turned him back into a public emergency. Afterward, he was transferred to Walpole State Prison. Those later events did not solve the old murders, but they kept DeSalvo in the news as a figure who seemed to move between confession, danger, and institutional failure. His death in 1973 came before any final public reckoning could force the old confession into a courtroom structure. A living defendant can be confronted with contradictions. A dead confessor leaves investigators with recordings, recollections, legal maneuvers, and the memories of men who had reason to defend or doubt him. DeSalvo later recanted. In 1973, he was killed in prison. His death froze the case in an uncomfortable posture. For believers, the confession remained powerful. For skeptics, it remained unresolved. For families, The official story could feel either like overdue certainty or like a door closed too quickly. A dead suspect is easier for public memory than a living defendant. He cannot change his account, face cross-examination, explain mistakes, or point towards someone else. The story hardens around him unless the evidence keeps pushing back. The Boston Strangler case became durable because it contains resolution and doubt in the same folder. DeSalvo was a violent sexual offender. He confessed with detail. Decades later, DNA linked him to Mary Sullivan. He also recanted, was never convicted of the murders, died before a full trial could test the confession, and remains forensically linked to one victim, not to every woman in the public series. The multiple offender theory is uncomfortable because it takes away the shape people expect. One killer gives the story a single villain and an apparent arc. Multiple offenders would mean Boston lived through overlapping crimes that a headline welded together. That possibility does not make the fear false. It makes the file harder. A famous label behaves like a container. Once people trust the container, they begin placing events inside it. The container may be mostly right, partly right, or too large. The danger comes when the label begins doing work the evidence has not finished. Mary Sullivan's apartment shows why the method cannot be hidden. Her case is not understandable without the physical evidence. She was sexually assaulted and strangled, and later discussion of the case focused on the ligatures and the biological evidence that remained. Those details are difficult, but they are not decorative horror. They explain why her file could later be tested when so many old questions could not. The Sullivan case became the bridge between the confession and the lab. The confession had placed DeSalvo inside the story. The surviving evidence asked whether science could place him inside the room. Those are different kinds of proof. Mary Sullivan's case is where modern science returned to the file with the most force. She was 19 and had recently moved from Cape Cod to Boston. She rented an apartment on Charles Street in Beacon Hill, a neighborhood of old buildings and narrow streets, where the city can feel pressed close around you. In January 1964, she was found dead. Her case is commonly described as the last and youngest of the Boston Strangler murders. Her death matters inside the debate because it became the place where science could test DeSalvo's name. If the evidence linked him to Sullivan, the confession could no longer be dismissed as pure invention in that case. If it failed, the entire public story would have weakened sharply. Cold case work began, with the kind of patience that rarely photographs well. Someone reviews what evidence still exists. Someone checks whether testing will consume material that cannot be replaced. Someone looks at a lab request, a chain of custody note, and a grant file, then decides whether an old item can still speak. In 2009 and 2012, Boston received grants through the National Institute of Justice Cold Case DNA program. The administrative line looks dull until one understands what it made possible. A grant can reopen a box. A lab request can reopen a murder. Investigators used YSTR testing, which focuses on the male Y chromosome. Because the Y chromosome passes through the paternal line, the result can point to a male lineage rather than a single individual at the first step. Fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, nephews, and more distant male relatives in that line can share the profile. The YSTR result did not satisfy investigators by itself because it pointed to a paternal line rather than one man. That is a subtle but crucial distinction. A relative's discarded bottle could not convict a dead man. It could only say that the line attached to DeSalvo deserved direct confirmation. This is where the modern investigation shows its discipline. It did not stop with the dramatic family line lead. It did the harder, stranger, more intrusive thing. It went back to DeSalvo's body. The exhumation turned a historical suspect into a direct biological comparison. The first modern path ran through DeSalvo's family. Investigators compared biological evidence from Sullivan's case with DNA connected to a nephew of DeSalvo. According to 2013 reporting, police secretly followed the nephew and collected DNA from a discarded water bottle. That bottle is one of the most important small objects in the modern case. It is not dramatic. It is ordinary enough to be thrown away. That is what made it useful. The test did not yet prove DeSalvo himself. It narrowed the male line and excluded almost everyone else. The case then had to move from lineage to the man who had confessed. DeSalvo had been dead since 1973, so direct confirmation required an exhumation. In July 2013, authorities exhumed his body. DNA was extracted from a femur and 3 teeth. Those samples were compared directly to evidence from Mary Sullivan's case. Now the second document on the desk gains its weight. The laboratory result did what the confession could not do on its own. It tied Albert DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan through biological evidence rather than memory, performance, legal strategy, or public mythology. NIJ later described the statistical conclusion in stark terms. The odds that a white male other than DeSalvo contributed the evidence were 1 in 220 billion. For Mary Sullivan's case, that is a powerful answer. For the whole Boston Strangler series, it is not a universal answer. DNA has authority, but it has boundaries. It can answer the question attached to the evidence that survived. It cannot test scenes where comparable evidence no longer exists, where it was never collected, where records are incomplete, or where the old item cannot be used. The Sullivan result changed the weight of DeSalvo's confession. It proved he was not merely a man inventing a role in that case. It did not prove he occupied every room in the series. It did not erase scene differences. It did not transform a disputed confession into 13 separate murder convictions. The disputed boundary of the series remains for specific reasons, not just because mystery is attractive. The victim ages varied widely. The geography crossed police jurisdictions. Some scenes fit the public pattern more closely than others. The confession was never tested in a murder trial. Some details that seemed private may have moved through press coverage or institutional channels. Modern DNA, answered Sullivan, not every room in the series. Those reasons are concrete. They keep the case from closing in the easy way, even though one part of it now has a very strong answer. The headline, the confession, and the DNA each stop at a different line. The headline organized public fear. The confession named a man and offered a story. The DNA proved one crucial link. None of them should be forced to do the work of all three. The file loses its shape when these facts are softened into abstraction. The women were not simply found dead. They were killed in private rooms, often by strangulation, with sexual assault and ligature evidence forming part of the pattern. Those facts are not gore. They are the case mechanics. Remove them, and the public label stops making investigative sense. At the same time, the case should not become a catalog of suffering. The ligatures matter because they help explain pattern recognition. The lack of forced entry matters because it explains fear at the door. The varying ages and scene differences matter because they explain why the one-killer theory remains disputed. The DNA matters because it proves one part and limits the rest. If I close the folder, I close it with both documents still visible. The newspaper clip belongs to a city that needed language for fear. It carries the texture of ink, deadline pressure, newsroom phones, and reporters trying to make scattered facts hold together before the next woman opened the next door. The DNA report belongs to another world. Cold case funding, YSTR charts, a discarded water bottle, an exhumation order, a femur, 3 teeth, and a laboratory conclusion that arrived almost 50 years after Mary Sullivan was killed. Between those documents are 13 women whose names should never be smaller than the nickname: Anna Slezers, Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Irga, Jane Sullivan. Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Sammons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, and Mary Sullivan. The public remembers the Boston Strangler because the phrase was built to last. The file asks for a more careful memory. A phrase can organize fear without proving every boundary. A confession can sound complete while still needing evidence. DNA can answer one question with force while refusing to answer questions it was never able to test. Albert DeSalvo is part of the answer. In Mary Sullivan's case, the modern evidence makes that clear. For the whole series, the honest sentence stays narrower. He confessed, he recanted, he was never tried for the Strangler murders. And the DNA that arrived decades later solved one crucial part of the file, while leaving the larger public label open to debate. The case remains between a headline and a laboratory report, between the name a city repeated and the proof an investigator can carry, between one confirmed modern link and 13 separate lives.